Sorry for the delay, so we will start. It's a great pleasure to hear Lucas in this very final stage of his PhD, but not of his research. And so without further delay, Lucas is going to explain to us what he has been working on for so many years.
So many years indeed. Thank you, Patrick. So welcome everyone here in the room, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in remotely. Most of you are from the Netherlands, so hallo iedereen. So it's, I want to extend a special thanks again to the jury for coming together once again to evaluate my work. Because as you know, this is my public defense, but a little bit over 2 weeks ago, I already defended my work to the same jury where we went over the details and I was assessed on the scientific rigor of my work. Today, the presentation will be slightly different. The idea is to present my work for a broader audience, which includes many people who are not in academia or have a scientific background. So for that reason, I stripped away. All right, so the goal is slightly different, as I said. I've removed a lot of the details, and the idea is that everyone can follow what I did, what I worked on a conceptual level. So many visuals, and I hope you enjoy. It's, for me, a real pleasure to finally present my work to all of you, also people back in Netherlands. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm presenting 2 studies that we conducted in the context of my PhD, where we used a method called fMRI neurofeedback, and we used that to investigate human face perception. So 2 concepts I want to clarify a little bit. Neurofeedback, what is it? And face perception, what exactly do I mean by that? So let's start with the method. fMRI neurofeedback at its core aims to improve cognitive functions or clinical outcomes, depending on your population that you're testing. And we do that by training participants to modulate, to gain control over their own brain activity. And we do that by giving them access to that brain activity in near real time. So how does that work? We have a participant in the MRI scanner. We record their brain activity. That data is sent to an image reconstructor, and we collect that data in real time. But rather than analyzing the activity data days to weeks or even months after the acquisition, we analyze it on the fly. So that information, those data are sent to a computer which has neurofeedback software running, and this software allows us to process and statistically analyze all the data that comes in real time. And on our end, it looks something like this. So here, this is an example of a real participant. I sped it up slightly. You see that over time, the participant uses different brain regions to a different extent as time evolves. So this participant is trying to increase certain brain regions, and we as researchers get a glimpse into that activity, which is really cool. But more importantly, what it allows us to do, this software, is to extract activation from one or more regions. And what we do, we couple that activity to a feedback display. And in our case, this was a very simplified thermometer, basically just a red bar that would start to move according to the activity in the region of interest. And because we provide that feedback display to the participant in the scanner, he or she can come to learn how to control their brain activity. They use the feedback cues. Whenever that the feedback is going up, it means the activity in the region is going up. And so we have as an instruction, okay, try to find ways, maybe think about certain things that you can reliably link to the movement on the thermometer. And because the regions that we were interested in were all face-related regions, usually the content was face imagination. So they were thinking about faces, visualizing them, maybe from loved ones or fearful faces, things like this. So if this all works and the participant manages to learn how to control that activity, then we as researchers are interested to see if this leads to enhanced cognitive performance, which we measure with usually behavioral tasks, or maybe improved clinical symptoms, depending what your research is about. So the studies that I present are mainly focused on increasing or improving cognitive abilities, face perception. So we use this method in two studies. In the first study, we used it to investigate face perception. And in the second study, the focus was more on improving face perception. So I'm saying face perception, but what does that mean? Face perception or face processing, I use those terms interchangeably. While they're not entirely the same thing, but for all intents and purposes, let's equate them today. So face processing describes the process of how the brain perceives, analyzes, interprets, and responds to faces. So from this lengthy definition, we can already tell that this is not a single brain function. In fact, it's a culmination of many codependent processing stages. And we can readily learn this if we think about all the different kinds of information that we extract from faces. We can identify an individual, we can say something about his or her gender, the age, but also the emotional expression on the face is important. So I want to start with an example of two such processing stages that are central to the first study and to some extent the second study, face detection and recognition. So from this noisy background, I slowly reveal to you the image of a face. And I pause it here. And I think we can all agree that a face starts to emerge here, right? We see the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and there's some oval shape. But beyond this, we don't know much else about this face. We don't know who it belongs to because you don't have enough visual detail to make that kind of classification. But if I provide your brain now with more details, then all of a sudden you can come to realize that you might recognize this person and maybe very well, just by giving you more details. And we also can say something about the age, the gender, etc. So face detection is interesting. It's arguably the first thing that needs to happen when we process faces, and it requires us to extract all the common features of a face. And usually, as researchers, we refer to this T-shaped schematic of a face in the eye, nose, and mouth configuration. And it's actually a very simple pattern that we need to analyze, right? Or that we need to find. And in fact, any stimulus that adheres to these principles has a high probability of being perceived as a face by our brain, which is why we can see faces in clouds sometimes, or in tree trunks, or in houses, depending on the constellation of the different elements. So face detection doesn't require a lot of visual information, but face recognition does, because we need to engage in fine-grained analysis of the face. We need to understand what makes the face in front of us unique and what sets it apart from all the other faces that we know. And so it requires more visual information. So those are just two processing stages, but I said there are many more. So let's put them in their wider framework of face processing. So let's imagine that this is face processing proper from start to finish. It takes maybe a second or a little less in your brain. And so this is face processing from an information processing perspective. And let's imagine the following scenario where I present to you a face of Tom, and Tom is a good friend of yours, and you had a coffee with Tom last week. So what might happen? So there's a detection process. Once you have detected a face, you gather more information and you come to realize that you recognize this person. You retrieve the name, you have access to a personal memory, and then you remember that you had coffee with Tom last week. And concurrently, there are these other processes that are also ongoing in your brain. You might gauge his attractiveness, where is he looking, things like this. Now, a lot of research has gone into this over the last 20 to 30 years, so we have quite a good understanding of the functional neuroanatomy of face processing. And I just want to briefly go over that. We can go very complex, but we're staying very simple, let's say. So we have a brain here, and let's present this brain with a face. Now, pretty much in all individuals, you have these highly phase-sensitive, phase-specific regions that activate that are near the back of your brain. And they are called the occipital phase area, the fusiform phase area, and the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus. Now, one way to think about what these regions are doing collectively is they present the brain with a crisp, detailed image of a face. And once that is established, you have all these other regions that get involved and that extract information that they themselves are working on. So collectively, these regions, these three regions are called the core phase network. And as I said, they take care of the visual analysis of faces, which means they're involved in detection, face feature analysis, eyes, nose, mouth, etc. They allow recognition to occur because they provide that detail that we need. They're involved in the visual component of emotional expression analysis, eye gaze, lip movement, and dynamic facial movement as well. So once a face representation has been established, as I said, there's these other regions that get involved, and these regions are less face specific. Regions like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are involved in many cognitive functions, but also in face processing. And collectively, these are referred to as the extended phase network, which are taking care of the abstract analysis of faces, which means they're involved in emotional expression, person memory, recognition, trustworthiness, face motion, visual attention, attractiveness, etc. And so these regions are heavily interconnected. So those are actually networks, and it's the networks that make the perception happen. And it's hardly any region functions on its own. So in the first study, we focus on recognition and face detection in relation to the occipital phase area and the fusiform phase area. And in the second study, we zero in on the FFA and its involvement in face detection alone. So now we have a little bit of the background. Let's dive into the first study, where we use neurofeedback to investigate the roles of FFA and OFA in face detection and recognition. Now, why would we do that? If you read the literature, there's still some disagreement as to the precise nature of how visual information related to faces propagates through the core phase network, and in particular between the FFA and the OFA. And as a result of that disagreement, different functional roles are attributed to different regions. So let me explain. We have a hierarchical model, and according to this hierarchical model, face processing is local to global. We start with the details, and from that, we form a complete percept, which means that visual information related to faces arrives first in the visual cortex, that starts to propagate forward, first to the OFA. OFA is the first one to respond to face information and is involved in face feature analysis and can be linked to face detection. Now, that information propagates further, and at the level of FFA, we have a complete face percept. We have enough understanding information to make a recognition judgment. So FFA is mainly involved in recognition. The non-hierarchical account, on the other hand, proposes quite the opposite. They say face processing is a global to local process, where we start with a crude face representation and we fill in the details later on, which means that face-related information first arrives in OFA, it bypasses in FFA, it bypasses OFA. FFA holds a crude face representation, is involved in face detection, and once a face is detected, other phase regions are recruited, one of which is OFA. OFA is involved in phase detailed analysis. Eventually at the level of FFA, or maybe more frontally, there's an integration process from the crude with the details, and that integration, the result of that leads to a complete face percept, and then we have enough information to understand who we're looking at. And in this case, it was, of course, Tom. So according to the non-hierarchical model, both of these regions are involved in recognition, mainly OFA, but FFA to some extent as well. So in the first study, we used neurofeedback to try to train participants to increase the activity in one of these regions and to see how that differentially, hopefully, affected face recognition and face detection performance.